All right, I guess we'll get rolling here today. Lecture 10, cost curves and competition. It's kind of an exciting and interesting day. We learn about a lot of the intricacies of decision making and business decision making. So yes, there's a question right off the bat. Say that again? Oh yeah, no, I'm not taking attendance today. So don't everybody get up and leave. You know, it's a random variable. So don't have to do it all the time, just most of the time. Feel ripped off now, I hope. I hope not. Anyway, so yes, for the reading materials for today, chapter 10. Let me just mention that as part of the general flow of the bookkeeping here today. So the first exam, I guess, is now kind of firmly in the rearview mirror. I've been doing a lot of corrections over the past couple of days. If I haven't gotten to yours, I'm working on it. Hopefully, I'll have them all done over the next 2 or 3 days, and then by I guess class Monday or Tuesday, I'll have it all uploaded into Blackboard and all of that. One thing I'm going to mention, I don't know if I say it here. Well, I do say it here. I'll emphasize it. Please, if you're in this section, this is section 1, right? The 10 o'clock section. If you're in section 1, please make sure you are in Top Hat in section 1 and doing your work there going forward. So one thing you can do is, if you mistakenly enrolled in the wrong section, is you can start up a parallel account in the new section or in the correct section and work there going forward. And I'm asking you to do that. I don't think it's a big problem in this class. I think it's mainly the buffoons in the other class that have signed up for the wrong section. But going forward, please do that. It'll make my job a lot easier. So I did put 2 new readings in Top Hat, chapters 9 and 10. Chapter 9 is all about international trade, which we did last time. And chapter 10 is about what we're talking about today. It took me a little bit to try to figure out what I was going to do with people enrolled in the wrong section, mainly for the purposes of extra credit, right? Recording that at the end of the semester. So I think I've decided that, so now we have 2 new readings. And also a problem set, a new homework problem set is up for you. So don't wait too long. You'll notice that I did put the due date as the 4th of November. I believe that's a Monday. And maybe you remember from the first exam cycle, that's about the day that I will probably, I'm just going to move this a little bit. That's about the time around which I would like to have our next exam, right? So what I did was I just counted up about, I said, all right, well, when we get to about the 17, 18 lecture point, we should probably pause for another exam. That's how I got that. But it's not cast in stone. It's approximate right now. Grades up in Blackboard. Okay, I think I'm all set with that stuff. Right, maybe I'm just anxious to dive right in here to what we're going to start talking about today. And you can think about what we're doing here is maybe just almost backing up a little bit and thinking a little bit about the deep aspects of supply and demand, and where those market demand and market supply curves, market supply in particular, where they actually come from. Right? In some ways, what I've done, just to get us up and running with the basic methods of the class, I've kind of rushed past a whole bunch of things, right? You might have even noticed that I've glossed over some seemingly important details. So, as I bounce around to all these different examples, I guess we've talked about, automobiles at some points in time. We've talked about wine. We've talked about corn, bottled water, phones. Well, these are all very different products, right? And even within each product group, right, there are pretty big differences. So phones are all different, right? There's all these different brands of phones out there. Bottled water, same thing. Maybe not so much corn and wheat, but cars, of course, there's a big, size, gas mileage, quality, all of these things. So we're going to have to be a bit more particular going forward about what we mean, what the characteristics of the market are, I should say, in a couple of dimensions. And in this way, we're going to get kind of hopefully, by the time we're done with this project, we'll have a pretty deep understanding as to how industries work, right? Both, on a day-to-day basis, but also over longer sweeps of time. And in fact, that's one thing we're going to do as we move along here, is define a concept of economic time that'll help you think about how markets work in reality, right? And so, of course, this stuff is of interest in and of itself. So if you want to, do investment analysis and all that and sort of try to predict how a market is going to move over time, that's fine. But we're also going to be thinking about the societal aspects, right? What are these markets doing for society in general? And when we go through this whole thing with cost curves, we'll hopefully see that there's some additional information we can bring to bear there. Anyways, so that's kind of my questions bullet point there. That's what we're doing when we're talking about market structure here. What I mean by market structure, maybe I should have said this before, is things like, what sorts of products do firms produce, right? Like, what characteristics do products have? How are they different, if at all, right? How many firms wind up producing in this market? What other things do they do? Do they advertise? Do they engage in product development, R&D, all of these things, right? Okay. To start with, what we're going to do is focus, particularly today, we're going to focus mainly on just a way of understanding the day-to-day, I guess you could say, operations of a firm. So this is something like a short-term decision-making problem where most of what you have as a firm is in place and you're just kind of just making basic production decisions. That's where we're going to start, and then over time we'll build out the more complex aspects of decision-making, like investment, whether or not you want to get into the industry at all, those sorts of things. So, our first take environment, I'm looking at my slide now, I'm puzzled by it. Our first take environment where decision making is more or less free. I shouldn't say free, I should say simple, right? We're going to start with a situation in which most of these things are simple, right? Or there's really a small set of decisions that a firm has to make, and we can understand how they're made with a pretty simple mechanics. So those are the two decisions we're going to boil down to, right at the beginning here. Should I get involved in this market? And when I get involved in this market, if and when, what do I do on a day-to-day basis? Think about that as the big decisions that we're making, that our firm is making right now. Just those two things, right? So, and then of course what we're going to do is say, well, what do these independent decisions mean for society, right? Firms are just looking at what's in front of them, right? What the industry looks like, what they can do and what they can't do, and they're making decisions based on really just profits. Well, what does this mean for society, right? It's kind of a controversial question, right? You see it all the time. Well, profit maximizing firms, or maybe evil, or they're doing, they're undermining society. Well, is there reason to believe that's true or not true? And so what we're going to do is we're going to start off by thinking about what you can consider a purely competitive or a perfectly competitive market. And really this is, as I say, we've boiled down the industry so that firms are just making decisions about or using information on their costs, what they can do and what they can't do and how costly it is, and what the price is what the price of the product is in the industry. Okay, so what does this mean as we start off thinking about these decisions? Well, we're going to sort of just acknowledge that other things are important, but we'll put those aside for the time being. So we're going to say that firms in this industry produce the same thing, right? So this makes a lot of things simpler. We don't have firms deciding, how to position their product, what bells and whistles to include on their product, what quality to make, all of these things, right? We don't want to worry about that right now. Ultimately, we do. But let's start as simply as possible, right? So we're going to suppose that our firms are making a homogeneous product. So what kind of markets are these? Well, agriculture, you're making corn or wheat or oil, things like that, right? This isn't cars or phones or wine or something like that, right? Where you have other decisions to make. Also, when you think about everybody producing a homogeneous product, the same thing roughly, then you don't have to worry about much from the perspective of consumers either, right? Like your consumer doesn't have to worry about whether they're buying, what color oil they're buying, or whether it's high or low quality, or other aspects, what bells and whistles there are. It's just a decision, do I buy the product or not? So that simplifies things. We also will imagine that the firm is small relative to the market. Now, what does that mean? That means that our firm just kind of, or why do we make this decision? So, you can think about you're a little oil producer. Whatever it is you do doesn't influence the world price of oil. Well, why do we make that assumption? Well, we want to set up our decision-making model to be fairly simple. And so we can have the firm just sort of look at what's coming from the market and react to it rather than making a market, right? Or doing something that, advertising to get the market bigger, stuff like that. The firm just sort of looks at it and reacts to it, right? And then if we take these two things, we can sort of think about how firms make decisions. Once we understand that, right, these decisions about should I get in the market, how much do I produce, once we understand that, we can do these more complex cases. But we can also think about how this industry changes over time, right? What do we expect it to do in short periods of time, over longer periods of time? And in that way, as we move forward, we'll have a very nice paradigm, right, describing something like an ideal case or a benchmark. And we can ask these questions. Well, what happens if advertising is important? What if we want to think about R&D? How does that change our... It's CUNY alert calling. How does that change our model? And so, of course, students love to talk about all of these things. I should have put in here pricing strategy. Like, students are always very curious about, what sorts of rules you might follow for setting the price of your product. A while ago, I had a BA/MA student, right? One of these, I think I've mentioned them before. The students getting both a bachelor's and a master's at the same time, who was involved in pricing strategy for Toys R Us, right? Which is kind of interesting because, not only was this student doing stuff with pricing and some of these rules that we'll learn about, but they also were working for a firm that no longer exists, right? It actually, if you think about it even more, it exists in name only now, right? Which is kind of a whole bunch of interesting things, which hopefully we'll unpack as we move along. Okay. So how are we going to go about looking at these decisions? Well, we can boil it down to costs, and really the relationship between three types of costs, or three different ways of looking at the firm's costs. So we can think about total costs. Right? How much does it cost in aggregate to produce a certain number of units? So if I want to produce 100 units, how many dollars am I spending to do that? Right? If I want to produce 1,000 units, how many dollars am I spending to do that? Well, if we think about, if we add into that some consideration for additional costs, right? Given I'm producing 100 units, what does it cost me to produce 101 units, right? What does that 101st unit cost to produce? If I'm producing 1,000 units, what does another unit cost? Those are the additional or marginal costs, right, of producing. Average costs, right? What are my costs per unit? Right? That is to say, if I just think about I'm producing 1,000 units, what does it cost me to produce those units on average? That's cost per unit. And if we sort of put these three things together, in particular those last two things, we'll get a pretty clear understanding of how a firm should make decisions, right? And so one thing I don't know if I mentioned in this slide is that we're kind of not really thinking about, I have to hire this amount of labor and that amount of capital, and I need a building this size to produce these units. We're sort of thinking that all of those calculations are in the background. A dollar figure comes out of that, right? And given that we know we have to do that stuff, the dollar figure is what matters to us in the end. When you take Eco 200, you'll spend a lot more time thinking about the details of different mixes of inputs that you might use to produce things like that. For our purposes, costs are enough. One thing that we'll start off thinking about, or one thing that we will think about here, it's kind of important, a distinction between fixed and variable costs, and I'll hopefully show you why this matters. and how it kind of drives a lot of what we're talking about. We really think about those expenditures that we have to make regardless of how much we produce, and those expenditures that we make that vary with the amount of production, right? So oftentimes you just have to lay out a certain amount of money to get started, right? I have an example here, an oil rig. You might say, well, whether or not I pump any oil out of the ground here where my oil rig is set up, well, I have to set up the oil rig, I spend money on that, and there it is, right? And then if I don't pump any oil, I spend the same amount of money. If I pump 1 million gallons of oil, I've spent the same amount of money on the rig. So that's an example here. You'll notice, by the way, I did pick oil, and one of the reasons why I picked this is because all of those things I was talking about at the beginning of class, oil, it's actually not true that oil is oil. It turns out that you have to, it comes in very different qualities. Some oil is easy to refine, some is hard to refine, which is another interesting aspect of producing oil. But I picked it because it's a pretty homogeneous product, and we don't have to worry about, advertising our oil. We don't have to worry about, quality and all of these things. It's just how much oil do we produce, given the international oil market out there, right? Or do we want to be in the oil business at all, given the conditions in the market? And so, in this, I should also mention, this is another case where I'm starting off with what seems to be a highly specific example, but what we're doing is setting up this example to embody these general ideas, right? We can say, well, Baker's talking about oil, but really we can move his basic logic around to all sorts of industries that fit those characteristics I mentioned before, right? Where the product is homogeneous and the producer is small relative to the market. So once again, we start thinking about an example, then we generalize, and then we say, well, our generalizations are wrong, right? And we add to them, all those bells and whistles I was referring to before. So anyways, in my simple example, we'll suppose it costs $2 million to get an oil derrick set up, right? Those are our fixed costs. We have to spend that regardless of whether or not we produce oil. Then, as it happens, as we produce oil, our costs of producing each unit change a little bit, right? We might expect this from all we've said about things like, the principle of increasing costs, and even going back to the shape of the PPF. So, for example, here, the way I've set it up here, we're running the derrick. If we want to pump 1 unit, I'm just, if you want to make I'm making it simple here, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, right, as our units. But you can imagine, that this is, tens of thousands of barrels or something like that, right? If you like to have your units make sense. Anyways, our first unit of oil, right, we'll say costs 2 million or 2 units to produce, right? So if we want to pump this amount of oil out of the ground, it's going to cost us that. If we want to produce a second barrel, right, that will cost us 3, given we're producing the first barrel. And I'm going to show you how this looks on a table. You have to be really careful about this, keeping the totals and the marginals, the additionals, separate, right? So what this means is, given we're producing 1 million or 1 barrel, 1 unit, producing the second unit costs 3. Given we're producing the second unit, the third unit costs 4, right? So the costs are steadily, for each additional unit, are going up. Why might this be the case? Well, oil's a good example, because if you want more oil out of a given well, you typically have to, you have to more than double the effort to get it out of the ground, because, the next unit of oil is just deeper in the ground, right? For the immediate, in the time frame we're thinking about. And so on for even, additional units past that. Okay. So, this, by the way, I'll remind you, we've talked about this idea before, this principle of increasing costs. And this is why, we talked about marginal costs, the costs of providing additional units. This is why we think they're going up. Right? And of course, ultimately, I've said this before, but we're going to make it concrete as we move along. This is why our supply curve slopes upward. And really this here in my third bullet point, the idea is that we need more additional effort, labor, so on and so forth, to get an additional unit of output, given we've already produced a certain amount of output, right? And as I said before, I wish we had the time to talk about production economics in more detail, but you do a lot of that in Eco 200. And it is this reflection of the law of increasing costs. I feel like I was a little redundant there, but those things are worth emphasizing. Anyways, if we look at I'm going to arrange this on a table here. It'll kind of look like this on a spreadsheet sort of setting here. So all of that information I talked you through, if we think about output, well, when I'm not producing anything, we would say I don't have any variable costs, right? But I still have to spend $2 in fixed costs. So that red number there is my fixed cost number. And that would mean my total costs when I produce nothing are 0, right? I'm sorry, my total costs when I produce nothing are 2, right? When I produce 0 is what I meant to say, total costs are 2. When I go up to 1 unit, as my story goes, well, now I incur $2 million to produce that first unit, and to get the total cost then, when I produce 1 unit of output, right? Well, you add those two things together, 2 plus 2, variable cost plus fixed costs, that gives me 4 million total, right? Or 4 units total of cost. When I increase output to 2, right? Well, you'll see here variable costs go from 2 to 5, right? That was because given I'm producing 1 unit, producing that second unit costs 3, right? The marginal costs, as you might say, have gone up. Right? Principle of increasing costs there. Looks like everybody's with me there. That's usually a tough one here. So there's if you want to unpack it here, I know this is kind of weird notation. I kind of like this, by the way, because it reminds me of a little bit of David Ricardo, who is maybe one of the first economists to sort of start just thinking about numbers. And this is kind of what he did after he read The Wealth of Nations. He just started saying, well, let me just write down tables of numbers and see if it makes sense. And that's kind of what we're doing here. And at the same time, we're thinking about maybe the best way to organize all of these moving parts, right? So you can think about that going on here. Anyways, as we move along here, you can see, for example, moving from 3 to 4 units, right? Well, 3 units we're drilling pretty deep. So as we go from 3 to 4, that adds 5, right, to our total cost. So that would indicate or capture the idea that the marginal costs of producing that 4th unit are 5 million or 5 units, right? So now we're adding up all the marginal costs. We're adding to that fixed costs, right? And that gives us the total costs. So, by the way, one thing you might think about is going on here, if you wanted to really step back and consider how this relates to things we talked about earlier in the semester, well, you might be thinking about this 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5 as something like the sum of the area under the supply curve, right? You can see it's kind of steadily going up. And indeed, I had you it was kind of underhanded, but I taught you that before we did this, right? And so that's kind of what's going on here. But we're tacking on this fixed cost component as well. We didn't have that before, really. Okay. So hopefully you understand what's going on, and hopefully you're also looking at this and saying, well, that's probably not the best way to organize this information. And indeed, we have, sort of per unit costs here, these, and then, we have this weird sum over there. What we want to do is collapse this information in a way that makes a little bit more sense. And so maybe we can do it this way, right? Where now we've broken everything into total costs and average costs and marginal costs. So what have I done here? Okay, in this table, we start with 0 output, right? We know the total costs are 2. That's the fixed costs, right? Average costs, well, this is cost per unit, so you divide total costs by the output there, 2 divided by 0. That gives you infinity, right? So, we don't worry too much about that. And of course, I don't have any marginal costs because I haven't actually changed, I haven't added a unit of production yet. But things really start moving here when I go from 0 to 1, right? I produce that first unit. Well, my marginal costs, maybe this is the best way to do it. That first unit I produce, I now incur 2 units of cost there, right, $2 million. My total costs are 4, and then I can get my average costs, my cost per unit, by dividing 4 divided by 1, that gives me 4, right? You can kind of, maybe I'm belaboring the point here, as we go from 1 to 2, you can see the marginal costs are incurred there. We get the total cost there, and then we divide total cost by output to get our cost per unit, and we get this kind of the rest of the relationship here. And of course, we see that our marginal costs are increasing. We kind of expect that from our first principles we've been thinking about throughout the class. But we also get something interesting here to not only just think about that, but we get this interesting aspect of average costs. Average costs are going down at first, right? And then they start going up. And we think of this as a general principle. This might be general principle number 1 that we've developed here. Why do average costs go down and then go up? Well, think about it this way. As we produce more, our marginal costs are going up, right? So that tends to want to make average costs go up, as it is here. Right? It's going from 3.67 to 4. Marginal costs going up, tend to pull average costs up. But at the start of the curve, there's this other thing going on where we're kind of cost spreading, right? That is to say, we had this fixed cost, $2 million, and as we produce more, that fixed cost is being spread across more units, right? So that tends to lower the cost per unit, and you can kind of think about this as, this average cost curve, I'll show you a graph in a second, as being kind of a race between those two things. Spreading of the fixed costs, and then increasing marginal costs as we produce more and more, right? And that'll give us this going down and then up sort of shape. So without further ado, here's a slide for posterity's sake, just to redefine everything that we're looking here. And here I have a tantalizing geometric fact about average costs. We'll get to this in a second. Average cost is cut at its minimum by marginal cost, right? Average cost is cut at its minimum point by marginal cost. Why is that? That's a kind of a weird thing to say, and it's probably easier to see, but I'm hoping I can make you understand that. If I graph these two things from my example, right, the dark blue is average cost, has that U shape I was talking about, right? We're degrading the fixed cost, but then it starts going up because of higher marginal costs. And there's my marginal cost going 2, 3, 4, 5, right? And you can see it doesn't quite work out exactly right. But, it's because the Excel is a little too, or Google Sheets is a little too blocky, and I only have 4 numbers. But if you could draw these curves smoothly, you'd see that marginal cost goes right through the minimum of average cost, right? That is to say, when average cost gets to its smallest value, that's where marginal cost intersects. I have some better examples that'll show this, how it works exactly. So this becomes, by the way, this is not just we have our basic geometric facts about these curves, but this is not just about average costs and marginal costs. It's pretty much true of average and marginal anything, right? In future economics classes, you'll talk about average product and marginal product and all that stuff. We might do some of that, but I don't know if we will. We'll probably just stick with this. Why is that the case? Well, think about it this way. Let's suppose I computed the average height of everybody in this class, right? We just took an average height here. I don't know what it would be, 5'6", I don't know, 5'6", right? Let's go with that. What would happen if, say, Carl Anthony Towns, right, our newest New York resident, right, our high-profile New York resident, walked into the classroom and we recomputed the average? What would happen to the average? For those of you who don't know, Carl Anthony Towns is a professional basketball player. He's 6'11"? It would go up, right? I thought you were going to say, no, he's 7 feet or 6'10", or I might have gotten that wrong. Yes, if you add something to the average greater than the average, right? If the marginal, put another way, the additional is greater than the average will go up, right? Sometimes NBA players, like, their heights aren't that accurate. I went to UConn for graduate school, and so I would see basketball players around regularly, and some of them would be listed at 6'7" or whatever, and I was thinking, no way, Rip Hamilton, I think, he was walking around at the same time I was there, if you know who he is. I think his height was overstated by a awesome basketball player, by the way. Anyways, right, so you add something greater than the average to the average, it pulls it up. Well, by the same token, if say, Danny DeVito came into the classroom, do people still know who Danny DeVito is? Okay, yeah, like he's been in movies going back almost, 50, 60 years. First appearance, Danny DeVito, I think, was One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, right? But he was on the show Taxi back in the 70s. Anyways, Danny DeVito, very short. If he came into the classroom, right, shorter than the average, that would pull the average down, right? If you sort of assemble all of that, you can kind of see that that's what's happening here, right? Marginal cost is below average cost is being pulled down, right? Well, marginal cost is increasing, it'll eventually catch average cost then, right? One's going down, the other's going up, but starts below. It crosses at the midpoint, and now marginal cost is pulling average cost up. So that's a way of geometrically picturing that effect I was talking about. Spreading fixed costs versus increasing marginal costs, right? You can kind of see it going on there. Okay, so this begs the question. It's great to talk about the geometry of cost curves. I could do it all day. But you might ask at this point, why are we doing all this? Well, the answer is, this is about as simple a picture of a firm as we can assemble that allows us to capture really the big decisions that firms have to make. So I think about it this way. It might be a little bit more complicated than this in reality, but this is good enough for our purposes. I think about marginal costs as being the guide to day-to-day decisions, right? How much oil do I produce in a given period of time, right? Given my cost curves. Average costs sort of tell me the consequences of these decisions, right? When I produce this amount, which I've used my marginal cost curve to figure out, what then do I get at the end of the day, right? And then this average cost, if you think about it this way, the way I said that, at the end of the day, what do I get? That then becomes a guide to making decisions about whether or not I should be in the oil business at all, right? What do I do while I'm producing oil? Marginal costs. Should I produce oil? What do I get when I'm producing oil? That's kind of average costs, right? We can push this a little bit further, and we'll do a little bit of this. We could say that marginal costs somewhat analogize with short-run supply, right? That is to say, supply over relatively short periods of time. I'm just throwing that out there for now. We're going to come back to this later. But I did say at the beginning of class, we're trying to understand industry dynamics. When you use the word dynamics, it implies you have a time dimension, right? And so this might I'm sort of hinting at that here. The marginal costs, you might say, determine kind of how the supply curve looks in an industry over short periods of time. Meanwhile, we're going to think about these average costs, right, as dictating much about the long run behavior of an industry. And of course, I've used these words, short run, long run. We don't even know what those mean yet, but I'm just throwing them out there to get time into your head a little bit. And in fact, I made my presentation was a little bit too sparse, I think, and that whenever you're talking about production, right, it is a flow variable, so it should have a time element. So when I was talking about this stuff, I should have said this is output per week or something, right? I should have said this is how much oil we're producing over a period like a month or a week or whatever it is, a day. Okay, so I have to be careful. I've cautioned myself there. Okay, so these are the sorts of questions we're going to start thinking about first And you might think about, your whatever industry you're in here, you might say, well, I was producing 1,000 units and the price was $10. What happens when the price rises to 12? How many more units should I now produce, right? When the price changes, put another way, it goes up, it goes down, whatever it is. How do I respond to that as a firm? And this is really what we mean by a day-to-day decision, right? Or a short-run decision. That's all I'm thinking about. And notice, by the way, how all these assumptions I've made about the model, boil it all down to that. Do I produce more or less? I don't have to say, oh, well, the price has gone up to 12. Now I have to advertise more, and I want to increase the quality and add this protection plan for consumers. No. We've made the problem simple by assuming our market has certain characteristics, so we don't have to worry about all that, right? It's just, what do I do? When the price goes up, how do I respond? And there's actually a very simple answer to this. And one of the reasons why we've been talking in such great detail about marginal costs is because all you have to do is you have to say, all right, well, whatever the price is, I'm going to try to produce where my marginal costs are right around equal to that price. A rule of thumb. P equals MC. That'll be my best response, if you want to think about it that way, to changes in price. Just get your marginal costs equal to the price. Okay, so I'm not going to stop there. We're going to think about why in a second here. So you can think about that as one decision. We'll talk about that. But then you can think about this other decision. Maybe somebody is waiting in the wings and is admiring my oil production operation and says, well, the price has gone from 10 to 12. Maybe I should be producing oil too. Should I do it? Well, let's see. I'm going to have to buy a derrick, and then I'll have to think about all these day-to-day decisions. But, right, I can, use all of this stuff, the tools that we've been talking about, in particular average cost, to figure out the answer to question 2 here, right? So average costs will then determine how I behave in this sense. So it's kind of, it's one of these things where this competitive, the situation we're talking about where we're just worrying about this one thing, hopefully you're starting to see why that's a useful way of thinking about things. Because there's all these moving parts when you're trying to make these business decisions. And here, we've made, I don't want to say reality, but we've made the situation conform to a very simple set of things, but it's really not as simple as you might think, right? But we are organizing our thinking about how decisions should be made, which I think is a useful thing. So I'm going to change gears right now. Enough about oil. As much as I would like to have an oil operation, my dream has always been to produce. Yes? Go ahead.
Sorry, I probably missed that part. Why is the fixed price of producing 0 units? We still have it. Why? For what?
Okay, so
oil.
So the question is, why do we still have costs when we produce nothing? Well, there's actually a very subtle answer to that, right? And I glossed over it here. So I'm supposing that we've gone ahead and bought, maybe we've rented a derrick from someone, right? And we've rented an oil derrick. They say, all right, well, you have to pay us $2 million per month to use this thing. And you say, fine, here's the money, right? I've spent that, right? And then whether or not I produce oil, right, I still have to pay my $2 million in rent, right? That's kind of what we have going on. But your question is a good one, right? It's, well, why would we spend the $2 million if we didn't know whether or not we wanted to produce oil? And therefore, how can that be a fixed cost, right? That's a very subtle issue of timing, and I was trying to sneak it past you, but you can put that into the back of your mind and say, well, over a long enough time frame, right, I don't really have any sort of fixed costs, do I? Right? Because I can say, well, I'm not going to produce oil at all. I'm not renting anything. So there is a subtle issue of timing. I don't know if that answers it. Maybe it just makes it a little bit more intriguing to think about where we're going. But that's a great question. Anyways, I'll move on without having really satisfactorily answered it. Anyways, as I was saying about grilled cheese, I'm going to switch gears here, and we'll imagine for a minute that grilled cheese is a relatively homogeneous product. So all the assumptions that we've talked about so far are still in operation. right? And indeed, you can think, now I've made my example a little bit better. Indeed, one reason why I'm doing this is to give you some more details here. We're going to say that we're talking about hundreds of units of grilled cheese per day, and we'll think about dollars and thousands of dollars or hundreds of dollars also. So now we have this is my operation. You know, I have maybe a cart. I park outside Hunter College. I sell some grilled cheese sandwiches, which are the same everywhere, right? Homogeneous grilled cheese. I'm not adding any tomato soup or any advertising or anything like that. And we'll suppose that works out fine. And now what we're going to do is think about my profit, how I want to respond to different prices in the grilled cheese market. So some more details. I'll rent my grill for $8 a day. What does that mean? Well, $800, I guess, $8 a day. That's like my fixed costs, right? And then I'll say that it costs me 50 cents in labor, right, to produce that first unit. And then we'll compute total costs, as usual, adding the fixed costs to the marginal costs. But now we're adding this information on the market price, which I've picked here to be $4, right? Just for the sake of argument. Strikes me as a very reasonable price for a grilled cheese sandwich. And so what we care about, of course, are profits if we're firms. So now what we want to do is take all of this information about costs and all of that stuff and the market price and make it into profits. And then really the question becomes, how do I make those profits as large as possible, right? That's what a firm wants to do, is maximize its profits. How do I do that, right? Well, luckily, I've put all of my operation onto this handy spreadsheet here. And here you can kind of see, if I were a business, I don't know if business owners actually do this. We do have a class, by the way, that we teach periodically in managerial economics, which kind of brings a little bit more accounting to the theory and forms a guide as to how to actually implement these decisions in a business environment. It's kind of a fun class. We're also toying with the idea of introducing a computational economics class, which might be bring some computer programming in. Anyways, so this is my advertisement for such a class. You can see here I've put in my fixed cost information up there at 8. That was from my previous slide. And then, if you go down here, you can see when I produce 0 units, there's 0 marginal costs, but there's my total cost. If you're interested, I was trying to see here where the formula box is 8. That's not great. But as I go along here, you can see. I should have done this with a global, but I didn't. Anyways, you can see that this is kind of what I was talking about before. As I produce more units, I have my marginal costs going up. Right? Remember what that is. That's the additional cost of each unit. It's not 2 units doesn't cost 1 to produce, right? The second unit costs 1 to produce, given we're producing the first, right? Producing 8 units doesn't cost 4. Producing the 8th unit, given we're producing 7, costs 4. That's what this means. So this is my total cost, right? And as I did on some of my previous diagrams, average costs are here. This is just this column, all the costs, divided by this column, the outputs, right? That gives me this. Now what I've added here, however, is this market price. Here I have a market price of 6. Let me change it to 4. I hope this works. That's where we started, right? Keep 6 in mind, though. All right, so everything changes here. There's my price of 4. Now, what I'm doing here, well, forget about this price marginal revenue thing for the time being. Look at this. This is my total revenue, right? All I've done here is taken units multiplied by price. So you can see here 10 times 4 is 40, and we get total revenue, right? Okay, and so now if your wheels are turning here, you can start to compare total costs and total revenue. Revenue minus costs gives you profits. That's this over here, right? It's a lot of moving parts, but you can look at the spreadsheet, the good news is, part of my point here is that there's a lot of numbers here. You don't really need to know all of these numbers to make a good decision as to how to maximize profits, right?
A question about this?
Yes?
This chart is saying that once you've made 10 units, you need to shut this shop because now you're going to start losing money, right? The total profits are not.
Okay. I wouldn't say shut the shop. What I would say is what you want to do, and this is good because you've recognized that the total, we want to stop somewhere. And it might not be immediately obvious where, but you can see here where we want to stop producing is somewhere around 8 units. Because my total profits have hit 6, right? And if I produce any more than that, they're going down, right? My profits start going down after 8 units. I'll show you a picture in a second. That's kind of interesting. Why are they going down? Well, you can say the costs of producing additional units at that point, right, aren't justified given the price I'm getting for an additional unit. So our maximum profits here occurs right around this point here. That's exactly what I wanted you to sort of intuit from this, right? Okay. It turns out there's a simpler way to do this. By the way, I have a picture here. I'm going to see if I can find it. I don't want to reveal too many of my pictures. We can look at a graph of total costs and a graph of profits. And I can show you something about the geometry here, what we're trying to do. This is even, oh no, I don't want to give that away. But you can see here kind of what we're trying to do. Our costs kind of go like this. Our total costs, right? They go up and up and up and at an ever increasing rate, right? Because our marginal costs go up. Right? Why does that happen in my grilled cheese stand? Well, if I have a grill this big and I have a cashier over here, if I'm trying to produce another, if I'm trying to go from 1 to 2, well, that's no big deal. But if I'm trying to go from 8 to 9 units, it's getting crowded. I need to spend a lot more resources to get the same amount of additional output because I have I'm running at capacity anyway. All right. So really, what we're trying to do is find the point of output where these two lines are as far apart as possible, right? That's kind of what we're trying to do geometrically here. And I've plotted those two things out. And as noted, you can see here at very small units, very small amounts of production, total costs are greater than revenue, so I'm losing money. In this whole area, revenue is greater than costs. But then once I get to that point, again, I'm losing money if I produce. So you want to sort of balance these things, right? The structure of my costs with the market price. So one other way of thinking about this, which is even better, is, what is this over here? Oh, I know what that is. I forgot all about that, but it's going to be important here. Is we can actually make this a lot simpler. Our price is $4, right? I've just put the price per unit here effectively, which in our setting is always $4. That's the market price, right? If we're selling the first unit or the 10th unit, the price is still $4. We are going to think about a world where that's not the case, right? That's strategic pricing, not now, right? This is hard enough, right? For the time being. Okay, so look at the price and the marginal cost here, right? And how they compare. And look at the profits over here, right? So here's price, here's profits, here's marginal cost. Maybe you notice something about this, right? Here marginal costs are 3, prices are 4, profits are 5.5, right? When we increase production from 6 to 7, right, we see marginal costs go to 3.5. Price is still 4, and profits go up, right? Down here, by contrast, marginal costs are 5.5, right? Marginal costs are 5.5. Price is 4. We can see here that profits are 3. Now notice what happens. Marginal costs greater than price here. When we reduce the amount we produce, we go from 11 to 10. Marginal costs fall. Price is still 4. Our profits go up. So if you look at this, I don't know if I said it as well as I could have, but if you look at it this way, you can see whenever price is greater than marginal cost, producing an additional unit raises profits. Whenever price is less than marginal cost, producing an additional unit reduces profits. So the rule of thumb then becomes, I'll tell you why, I'll give you an intuitive explanation in a second. The rule of thumb then becomes, well, when price is greater than marginal cost, produce another unit. When price is less than marginal cost, reduce production, right? Produce more when price is greater than marginal cost, produce less when price is less than marginal cost. Why is that the case? Well, just comparing price and marginal cost, well, that tells you, will an additional unit add more to my revenues or my costs, right? If it adds more to my revenues than my costs, I should produce that unit. P greater than MC, more. P less than MC, less, right? It just tells you very quickly whether you're adding more to costs or revenues. In the end, of course, if you ever get to a point where price is about equal to marginal cost, there's nothing you can do to change, right? You can't increase profits or you can't increase or decrease profits by changing what you're doing. Stay where you are, right? So this is the source of our rule of thumb. Price greater than marginal cost, produce. Price less than marginal cost, reduce. Price equal marginal cost. That'll maximize your profits. A simple rule. And I kind of say that here in my slides, I believe. Right here. Right? This summarizes everything I told you there. And if you kind of look at it this way, right? Let's see here. I'll bring my graph into play here. Here's my total cost and total revenue. Here's the average cost version of this. So if you remember my oil rig example, I had my average cost curve, had that U shape. This is my version of that here, the red curve. You can see, by the way, now the marginal cost is kind of hitting average cost right at the minimum, right? The geometry is more precise because there's more points. But I've added in this yellow price line, and what I'm telling you is that all we're trying to do when we figure out our profit maximizing production amount is find where the blue hits the yellow, right? The flat line where the price is at 4 hits the blue, right, which is marginal cost. Just find price equal marginal cost, that'll maximize profits. So maybe I can even organize this. Let me try this here. Don't try this at home. I'll make it so here I have my total revenue like that. I'll put this one here. If I line them up about right, let me see. Can I do this? What I'm trying to do is get this point to coincide with the maximum here. Maybe I can here's my profit curve, right? Really what I wanted to do is, I don't know if this is going to work. That's about right. So this point here should coincide with this point here, which is kind of maximum profit here, right? We're maximizing the profit hill by just looking where these two lines cross. Marginal cost and price are equal. I don't know if that helps, but you can think about the geometry there. So one thing we can do is we can actually fiddle around with the price. And let me get these things out of the way. Look at this curve over here. See average cost, marginal cost hitting price. All we care about is the yellow and the blue intersection there. But we can actually have some fun, as much fun as one can have in an economics class, by fiddling around with some of these things. So, for example, if I took a price of 4, we saw that my profit maximizing quantity was 8, right? Maybe you didn't think I was going to do this, but I'm just going to go ahead and delete all of that. What if I put a price in of 3? What quantity should I choose to maximize profits? See, I just changed that price to 3 down the board. Where do I maximize profits? It's a little tricky. Well, here I'm not actually I'm minimizing losses, right? Unfortunately, that's also an important part of economic decision making, is figuring out how to lose as little money as possible. Yes?
Would you do it at 6 units?
Let's see. At 6 units, yes. Okay, and hopefully you discovered that by just finding where marginal cost and price are equal. Well done, right. So we can say that a price of 3, I'm going to do 6 units, right? What if I put a price of 3.5 here? Well, hopefully you hone right in on the marginal cost equal 3.5 equal to the price. I have nice numbers here that work out nicely. So 7 units maximize my profits at that point, and you can see the evidence there in the last column, right? They're equal here, but these. So a price of 4.5. Let's continue this out, right? 4.5 is here, right? Marginal cost equal price, so that gives me 9 units. So my example works out all nicely here. So over here we have, by the way, a little relationship between the quantity a firm produces and the price of the product. What do you call that? That's a supply curve, right? That's the firm's supply curve. I just sort of derived it for you using its marginal costs. Right? So once again, you can now see why, maybe this, if you think about that a little bit, you can see why price and marginal cost are the same thing, right? I'm sorry, cost and supply are the same thing. Marginal cost and supply. I think I got it right that time. It's pretty neat, right? And what if we raise the grilled cheese market goes crazy, goes to 6? That's where we started. Well, let's see here. I'm just looking for marginal cost equals 6. And that gives me, 12 units. So, one thing you can also get out of this is if you just sort of sit back and think about it, you can say, well, now I can see why firms supply more at higher prices, and at the same time they supply less at lower prices, right? It's because of the shape of their cost curves that they behave the way they do. Okay, I think we're doing pretty well here. So it's a really great diagram, and it's going to become even better, right? It really got rolling as a tool in economics, this whole marginal cost thing. Marginal cost thing going in the early 1900s, late 1800s with the so-called neoclassical synthesis. So it's a pretty new idea, right? This isn't something that people have known for thousands of years or anything. That having been said, I've kind of mentioned this point. This is kind of an interesting thing to check out. This link leads to this article here, and it's an early application, maybe the earliest, of the average cost concept, average total cost, I guess you could say. And so you can see here this strange little application, 1796, Gottfried Christoph Hertel, right, bought for 106,000 Reichsthalers, publishing a music publishing business, right? And he started to think very carefully about how best to print out music, right? And he faced kind of the classic problem we face here, right? You have to print out, there's these variable costs of printing out units, each sheet of music, right? That involve ink and labor and all of that stuff. Right? It turns out you have to wipe some of the templates down. Those would be variable costs. But you also have to develop the template that you print from, and that's the big fixed costs, right? And so Gottfried Christoph Hertel was interested in figuring out exactly how this looked for different methods of printing. And it turned out at the time there were two ways to print. You could have a music score engraved on a copper sheet and then put ink on it and print it that way, right? Or you could actually typeset out the music, right, and then go that way. Now, both methods had their advantages and disadvantages, one of which was engraved music or engraved printing tended to be higher quality. And so that's one thing, we don't have that yet in our model. That was one thing he was worried about. He wanted to see what these cost curves look like for different amounts of, given you're going to print a certain number of sheets, what was the cost per unit given this fixed cost and the variable costs. So you can see here he found that typeset was typically cheaper right? The cost curve was lower. That might be one way of thinking about something that's cheaper in general. But it turned out to be of lower quality. Now, it's also interesting, there's a whole bunch of interesting facts about the music industry that come out here if you read this. You can also get the idea that he was maybe 75 years ahead of the economics literature on all of these things. And it also turns out that because of you can see here, these calculations that he made, his business calculations from his cost curves, it caused Hertel to lose out to other publishers for early Beethoven works, right? Because he was, so, I guess that's maybe why we call it at sometimes the dismal science of economics. Maybe he thought too carefully about all of this and didn't think about other things, as we're going to think about going forward. Okay, one other thing I'm going to add about this, or one other thing I'm going to say about this, is on my grilled cheese operation, my theme for the day is this is difficult, so we don't want to try to do too much. I'm happy that we understood, seemingly, the marginal cost equal price, profit maximization thing. I still have that red curve, the average cost curve, right, going across my entire diagram, and I haven't said much about what that's going to do. I've only hinted at, this will tell us, how much money we're making, what we're going to do in the long run. Maybe I'll foreshadow next class's remarks by saying, well, what we can do is we can look right at this diagram, we can see where to maximize profits, and then we can see what profits are like, or what profits are when they're maximized using the red curve, right? So we figure out the best decision, and we figure out the consequences from the decision using average costs. It's a rectangle, but we'll leave that next time, and I guess we're done a little bit early today, so have a great weekend, work on your homework and reading, and I will see you next time.